Okay, welcome, Eliot, to the Architects for Change podcast.
Thank you.
It's really great to be here in this really exciting studio. We've definitely a lot going on. So maybe can you start with telling me just a really brief intro about you and the
Sure.
work that you're doing at Heatherwick Studio?
Sure. So yeah, my name's Eliot. I am one of the 5 group leaders and partners at Heatherwick Studio. So I work across a whole range of different design projects, mostly architecture, but not entirely, across all different scales. And so my role at the studio is I sort of work with Thomas on the design direction of between 8 to 10 projects at one time. Thomas somehow manages to oversee all 40 or so. And then I work with the design teams to help deliver them and make them happen. And at the same time, there's sort of another avenue that's part of the studio leadership team, helping, figure out the world of structuring an organization like this and how we continue to evolve and grow and keep doing, hopefully, amazing projects.
Because you've sort of evolved from doing more, I suppose, products and sculptures to the built environment as well. So
yeah, well, interestingly, I think Thomas's interest in the built environment, despite he didn't study architecture, was evident when he, even doing his undergrad, his undergrad project, not studying architecture, was a building, which is actually downstairs in the space downstairs, so that ambition was always there to sort of make our way into impacting the sort of the biggest artistic pieces in the world, which is buildings ultimately. But obviously that went on an evolution over the last 30 years from working on smaller scale things, pavilions, furniture projects, buses, cauldrons. In the last 15 years or so, I've been at the studio 15 years. The last 15 years has been, we've been working more and more in the world of larger and larger scale architecture. And the last 5 to 10 has sort of moved into, up to kind of district scale projects, all the way up to an airport terminal at Changi's new airport in Singapore.
And do you feel that the ethos of maybe that more product sculptural background appears in the buildings that you design?
Definitely, like the attention to detail at that like small scale. Right now I'm designing a light, for example. And so those design dialogues you have around something that you can really hold in your hands and the nuance around that, absolutely we have those same discussions at the architectural scale. And I think one thing that's particular about the studio is our ability within projects, even when we might be at a district scale or at a very large building scale, we have design discussions that zoom in and zoom out, like all from like concept. We'll be, talking about how that idea manifests on the ground at the human scale as you're approaching a building, and how does that make you feel in a sense. And the best products are great at making you feel something about them and essentially making you cherish them and love them and want to keep them. And so that learning is absolutely applicable to architecture.
And I suppose that's the thing about buildings as well. If they're beautiful and we cherish them, we're more likely to keep them than demolish them, which actually leads perfectly to the Humanise, a good segue to the Humanise campaign. So the studio, head by Thomas, has launched the Humanise campaign. Maybe can you give me a brief background of its sort of key aims and ethos and how that then sort of feeds back into the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so the ambition of the campaign is essentially to spark a public, ideally global conversation around something that we have felt to be true, which is that there's maybe been this sort of slightly stealthy global catastrophe going on with our towns and cities all around the world. And that's that we are finding ourselves increasingly surrounded by sort of flatter, colder, more soulless buildings that are making up bigger and bigger proportions of our cities. And I think it's something that we have felt that is instinctively known to be true to us. And interestingly now, the more people that we've asked about it, when asked specifically, the public are aware that it's a problem. And I think like 57% of people when surveyed acknowledge that absolutely we are increasingly being surrounded by soulless architecture that's kind of defining our urban environments. And that then has unintended consequences, and 76% of people believe that architecture has a really serious impact on their mental health. And so we're also
and this is data that you've gleaned through the campaign as well.
So we've commissioned some surveys and we've commissioned some We've actually worked with some scientists as well to try and understand this better. And it's happened at a time where there's a really an interesting emerging field of neuroscience, neuroaesthetics, that scientists are now like really trying to understand how the human brain responds to form and very much architecture and detail and visual interest. And so there is now an increasing body of evidence that's enabling us to understand why detail and a richness in the urban environment is so important. But then the other side of the coin, so there's sort of the mental health aspect of that we believe it's very important for our well-being. The other side of the coin is the planet, ultimately. And, you know, it's sobering working in an industry that ultimately is responsible for 39% arguably
it's
of
bad.
global you know, carbon emissions. And if you believe that, which I absolutely do, that the climate crisis is one of the biggest challenges that we face socially at the moment, you know, the built environment is a huge contributor to that. And there's a sort of tragic statistic that a contemporary commercial building in the UK, its life expectancy is 40 years. And so we're at the same time, by not loving and cherishing every building that we build, we're in this crazy unintended consequence of cycle of demolition and rebuilding.
And not investing in the right detailing and materials to last. Because isn't it, Thomas has the ambition, or the Humanise campaign has the ambition of build to 1,000 years.
Yeah, and that's sort of there as a, you know, we understand that that's incredibly challenging. It's there as a provocation, but it's there to say, at the moment we've fallen into this trap of very short-term thinking, like quick profit, short-term thinking. And so the campaign is about sort of shining a light on what we feel is this problem and really saying, look, this isn't about niceness. This isn't about us saying that looks good or looks bad. This is actually serious for the population's mental health. More and more people are going to be moving and living in cities in the future. It's only going to be more important, and it's really important for the health of the planet. So we're, in essence, it's trying to just get more people engaged with that conversation, as many as possible.
So how does what you're saying for the campaign, how is that feeding back into, so maybe use one of your projects that you're working on at the moment as an example. Like, understand, are you working on the Olympia project at the moment? How is that feeding back into how you're designing? Has it changed some of your decision making? How maybe
so the campaign, like, we've tried to sort of distill down to like a really simple basic rule of what we feel the architecture that's kind of in a sense, sort of, the campaign is also about the outsides of buildings. It's very much focused on that and believing that they are, you know, they're the walls of our living room of our cities. And
it's what everyone, even the people who aren't necessarily using the building, or interact with.
So that, you know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people might walk past a building and a few hundred might ever experience the inside. And so this is very deliberately focused on that. And so we try to distill the campaign down into a rule that maybe sounds overly simplistic, but it leans into this idea of what's the right amount of basic detail and visual complexity that every building in a city should have. And that's that a building should be able to hold your attention for the time that it takes you to walk past it. So if that's a terrace house, might be a couple of seconds. If it's an enormous long office building, it might be a minute. But that there needs to be the sort of nourishment for the eyes to hold your attention so you don't just walk past it, you know, staring down at your phone the entire time. And we feel like that's actually quite a good like baseline litmus test. And so we use that for ourselves on our projects. But it's, in a way for us, the Humanise campaign has been a way of articulating the way that we've been designing for the last 30 years. So I don't think it's necessarily changed it, but it absolutely now, in a great way, for example, when the team grows, new people join the studio, it's a brilliant way of explaining why our projects are the way they are. And so then in design reviews, we're always trying to put ourselves in the point of view of that passerby, that user, and talk about feelings, like really overtly be talking about feelings, like how do we think you will feel approaching this entrance? What might make you feel better grabbing that door handle? And I think often, and I've worked in other architecture practices in the past, but I feel often we're sort of a bit scared about talking about feelings, and actually it's really important and often missed. And so if you take something like the Olympia project, the book also, it talks about 3 scales. So every project, architectural project, will think about these three scales within a city. So that's at the city scale. So what's the project doing for the skyline? And so in Olympia's case, that's been about how we're articulating this massing that's sitting on top of these amazing Grade 2 Victorian buildings, and trying to respect at the street sort of the listed facades and add a contemporary element that worked alongside that. And so the massing is responding to that and then is at the same time creating a sort of skyline profile. And then we sort of think about the street impact. What happens as you're walking past the building? What is going to hold your attention in the time it takes to walk past it? I mean, we had a lot to lean on at Olympia. We had the great reality that actually a big part of our project was like getting rid of all the modern, excuse the language,
the sort of bad, the shit additions.
The modern crap that had been put on, like, you know, you had this gorgeous 1880 Victorian facade that had these porter cabins slapped up against it to create like a modern entrance into the halls.
And some of that is actually just cheap function, like just function.
Pure
with
function.
That. I mean, we have that with a lot of our railway stations as well. It's like, oh, that's just, the lift is just bung there because it's functional, but nobody enjoys using it. There's no pleasure in it. There's no pleasure. I mean, I live in New Cross and they've put this new crossing over the station. Probably spent loads of money on it, but nothing about it is pleasurable. Yeah. And I suppose this is exactly like your point, isn't it? That a lot of these interventions, maybe they could be thought about a bit more.
Yeah, and I mean, they are a classic example of like zero visual complexity. Yeah. They're basically just white boxes blocking this like unbelievably gorgeous, ornate, crafted Victorian entrance. So a lot of it at that street scale was removing some of that stuff, letting that speak, but also we're sort of trying to create this elevated public realm that brings porosity to this really big site. So it was also about creating visual interest that would draw you up essentially 2 levels to this public realm that's on the sort of shoulders of the Victorian buildings. So we created so Olympia, the sort of traditional facade, has these 2 amazing vaulted Victorian barrel vaulted roofs that are the 2 exhibition halls. And we've created a 3rd glass sort of barrel vaulted roof. And you see that from the street, it kind of catches your eye. It's got this pleated glazing roof line that definitely is unusual enough for you to look towards it and then draw you up into that new public realm. And then becomes the door distance, so city street door. And at the door distance, which is where we think...
So we're saying the street is the public realm and the interaction of the new Victorian facade with the existing streetscape.
Yes, exactly. Okay. And then that final distance, the door distance, which for 99% of the architectural projects happening now, is the one that we think you should be spending 99% of the time on. Like in terms of where you add most value to the passerby, it's absolutely at that door distance. And so there, whether it's, you know, thinking about a door handle design that references kind of the pleated architecture of Grand's facade and is made out of timber, so it's something that you want to grab, or reinstating the 1929 Art Deco canopy that cantilevers out over Hammersmith Road, or lift buttons. Like we've been on a lovely journey with lift buttons over the years at the studio, but it's actually really rare, the moments in a building that you really do meaningfully touch.
Yeah, balustrades,
handles,
buttons.
You know, and buttons. But they're few and far between. Yeah. So they are a moment of attention and focus. And so using that, knowing that there is a moment of attention to reward the eye with something. And so yeah, on that project, we're designing some, they're out in the public realm, like as you approach the building, some lift buttons that, well, I can show you the design later, but are absolutely like something just feels like it's been cherished. Yeah. And feel like a lovely object and something that you want to touch, and through it being cast bronze, every time it is touched, you leave a patina and a mark on the bronze, and you sort of see the...
And this is in the public realm, so a general member of the public will interact with that
right
button.
On the street, yeah.
Which I guess, in a way, as a member of the public, I think does it then also? Do we think that if the space that you, as a member of the public, are interacting with, is cherished, it almost makes, it sounds like a naff thing to say, but do we think it makes you feel more cherished? Like somebody cares about the place that you live and that you interact with.
Well, I hope so.
And maybe makes you respect it a little bit more as well.
I hope so, and certainly. I mean, you think about it like in the context of housing. I know you've worked on a lot of housing projects, particularly when it comes to affordable housing. What your home can be subconsciously saying to you as to your worth and your value when you're looking at it up against other buildings in the city, other areas in the city, I think is really profound. And I think we underestimate the impact that can have. And there are lovely examples of, affordable housing projects that do just put that little bit of care that subconsciously I do believe has a big impact on people's mental health, and it does say something else to them that actually you are worth this, and this amount of care and attention. I hope it does speak to people and makes a difference in their lives.
No, I mean, as a housing architect, I would agree with that. And actually, I think that segues quite well into the campaign itself has had some criticism across the industry. And you're using the example of affordable housing. I think that's quite often would be the naysayers. Well, that's all very well and good, but what about how do we afford to do it? How do we deliver? The Labour government have got the ambition of 1.5 million homes, but how do we deliver those affordable homes and at that complexity? What would you say back to a critic?
So, well, first of all, the intent of the campaign was just to get people talking.
Yeah, which is good.
And I think it's done that. And so, in a way, we're just happy that people are engaging with it. And of course, you can't make everybody happy. But one thing that we talk about is in a little bit like there is now a broad acknowledgement, even within the development world, even within the development of affordable housing world, of the notion of a green premium. The idea that, for the health of our planet, we are going to have to be targeting our budgets and spending money to make our buildings and built environment more sustainable in the long term. And we believe part of that long-term sustainability relates to Humanise. And so we sort of see it as almost like a human premium. That there is, a completely flat brick wall is going to be cheaper than something that is just giving a tiny bit of detail up the street. But we believe that it's actually important to be having those conversations with clients or whether it's a local borough, that actually that human premium, whatever it might be, and we're trying to quantify it in different projects at the moment, is very, there's an economic case for it in the long run. In the lifespan of that building, that investment pays back in hopefully it lasting longer, it being cherished,
better mental health.
Better mental health, all those other things, that there's a net benefit to that. And it can be a modest investment up front. I mean, you've designed affordable housing projects that absolutely have a care and detail and have gone absolutely beyond just the absolute base requirement that they could have.
We always try and have that one, because again, when you are designing affordable housing, it's about having that one moment, where do you spend the money, which I think it actually does link back to those points that you have in the Humanise campaign. Okay, is it a balcony that's on the facade so far away, you get a some form of complexity and effect. Close up, you enjoy using it. It might be a certain shape or have a certain, and it's very simple, very, very simple, but have more effect than just a bog standard. Even sometimes it's a fight to get it through though.
I no doubt. I mean, I cycle past one of your projects every morning.
Oh, which one?
The Pavilion in Burgess Park.
And are you a South Londoner as well?
I am. I live in Peckham, so I cycle literally directly alongside it every morning, and that could have so easily been a flat facade. But you didn't. It's not. It's got a very slight pleat to the whole thing. It's got texture and perforation in the metal. You've bothered to put the signage into the concrete at the base of the building, and all of those things add up. And they're not huge cost swings, but they absolutely add up to that being elevated beyond what it could have been.
And particularly in a part of London where not a lot of money is spent on the community. Which I think, definitely adds to that feeling of, okay, someone's actually caring, the council are caring. I mean, an example of that, and sadly it's not one of ours and not one of yours, but the Appleby, can't say it properly, Appleby Blue scheme in Southwark, and I actually mentioned it in the last podcast because I interviewed a lady who's an expert on healthy homes, and it's an extra care scheme for the elderly. And it's a sort of courtyard. It's all made out of timber. It's beautifully designed, lots of detail. But even the layout, they think about where residents can sit. So so the sort of deck access isn't institutionalised. It's glazed, but it's not heated. There's benches outside each pairs of flats, so people are encouraged to sit. But also the whole thing is around this beautiful green courtyard. And there was the Housing Design Awards were there a few weeks ago, and you walked into the space and you automatically just went, I'd cycled there really, really quickly because I was late.
Right.
And you just think, this is actually a wonderful, it made me feel good being in there.
Yeah.
The people who live there, their health outcomes are way better than where they were living before. I think a lot of the hospital admissions have massively reduced. But they did say it costs 20% than what a standard scheme is. But what is a standard scheme?
Yeah.
And the question is, should the standard scheme exist?
But what is the other economic upside of the benefits,
Exactly.
the health benefits,
Exactly.
the fact that building might last longer? Like,
Exactly.
somehow we need to come to a place where we can quantify those things, and then that human premium becomes, whether it's 20%, 10%, 5%, becomes much more reasonable and actually is sort of a long-term gain. And yeah, we're just on that journey.
Yeah, I mean, it's particularly if it's a local authority funded scheme, because the money, in a way, sort of feeds back to. I mean, the pots are different, but it is sort of government money. So if you're saving money in the NHS, then that's absolutely huge.
Yeah, because you mentioned the like the fact that it's arranged around a courtyard and a garden, and that's one of the things that why we're excited by the neuroscience is because. So as an example, the science around views and access to greenery, particularly within medical environments, like it's very well documented. There's proof. Like you can argue and say, no, if your hospital bedroom has a view out over a garden, you know, your health outcomes are X percentage better. And that science is there to back that up. And the reason for that partly actually relates to what we talk about in architecture. So the visual complexity of nature is kind of what we've evolved as beings to be around. So our brain, like unbelievably, like it computes like 11 million pieces of information a second. And nature is a manifestation of that. Like the complexity of a plant, like the intricacy of light and shadow and movement in trees and being surrounded. I mean, imagine a urban environment that was genuinely reflecting the complexity of standing in a forest. It would just be like probably overwhelming, but it would be amazing the amount of richness there. And so this emerging field of neuroaesthetics and neuroscience is starting to be able to measure actually that level of complexity has a relaxing effect. So what you are feeling, you walk in there, and that can be seen with the built environment. Man-made things too can, you know, biophilic design is sort of reflecting some of those natural qualities, can have that same effect on us and the way that we feel.
Which actually, I'm glad you've actually given me some details on that, because from watching, coming to some of the Humanise events, it did make me think, is it actually a reflection of nature? Because I guess it's where we would find food, right? So if there's no complexity, then it's not a good outcome. If you're in the middle of the desert, it's not a good outcome. If you're in the middle of the Antarctic, it's a much harder environment to be in than if you're in the Amazon, for instance, in terms of access to food. And is that where the sort of neuroscience comes from?
Maybe, but then, you know, even if you are in the desert, you could probably argue that the visual complexity of a sand dune is actually quite extraordinary, probably, and it is probably actually very still quite nourishing for the eye. So whether it is, like there is that link to gathering, which maybe there is. I don't know, but
that was my theory.
But I definitely believe that our brains are absolutely hardwired to be surrounded by that level of complexity. And as we strip it away from the built environment, and you know, you really can see that in the last 70 years of the built environment has been a journey of stripping detail. You know, ornament is a crime. Form must only follow function. Don't decorate things. It is just sort of stripping that complexity out.
Which in some cases, there are examples where that works when you're using really, really, really good materials. But the problem is we've moved to trying to follow that theory, like the Le Corbusian theory, but with really cheap and nasty materials as well. And then it sort of degrades even further and further and further.
And also that was it was a reaction to something. And so there are times when, you know, simplicity and very clean lines are absolutely the right thing to do and are beautiful and calming within a context that's more, you know, rich and elaborate and is giving you that complexity. Then that moment of difference can be absolutely what's needed. But it's when everything is stripping that detail away and the 99% is stripping that detail away, and that we believe totally that form follows function, like absolutely. But we just think emotion is like a fundamental critical function of architecture, and that emotion piece and how a building makes you feel is very high on that function list, and so forms part of that.
But it's like the first thing you do, you know, when you go into a new home and you start to nest and you put your objects in different places, and it's actually, we are the designers of buildings and cities. We have the control, well, and the developers have control over that, and it is actually, you wouldn't do that to your home internally, so why would you do that to the city, if that makes any sense at all?
Absolutely.
It's that sort of, well, you have that care and attention, you know, you get the paint out, you put pictures on the wall, you buy nice sofas and nice cushions or whatever it might be, so you add that complexity internally, you don't completely strip it back. So we should be doing the same to our cities. So what do you think is the long-term goal for the campaign?
I'd love to say that in 50, 100 years' time that we could walk around any city in the world and it just fundamentally feels more joyful and engaging. That the future of the built environment is tending towards more visual complexity, surprise, delight and joy, I think.
Is there parts of the city, let's use London as an example, that does spark that to you already?
Yes.
That's a throwaway question.
But so often, and we're really blessed in London that we are surrounded by heritage, and so often it's the mix of the old and new that sparks that joy. And you know, the King's Cross master plan, that where we are now, is great. I think it's amazing. You've got a project there with the pavilion that you did right next to ours, and I think it's a brilliant master plan in London. If you took away all the Victorian architecture,
would it be the same?
Would it feel the same? I think probably not. And it's a really interesting challenge. We talk about it all the time, like, can we find a new build, large scale, ground up development that was all built at the same time, anywhere in the world, that feels like absolutely incredible? And it's really difficult. That is
really, really true. That is, because I think it's the stories and the history, which I think we all as humans like to be connected to. And if you are doing something completely new, how do you bring that story and richness back into something that is completely built from scratch? Which again, I think if you do have maybe a large master plan that's completely built from scratch, at least have a mixture of designers working on it as well, because at least then you get some complexity and difference in that way. So that's the long-term goal, is, you know, you want to see obviously the principles of Humanise across the built environment. We've got a new government which is very much focused on building new infrastructure, new homes, new places, new towns. Do you see government policy influencing urban design? What am I trying to ask? How do you see that influencing maybe your work, or how would you like to influence some of their policies? What would you like to see them do?
Well, first of all, I'm optimistic. Like, it feels like it's a fresh start, and there is a lot of focus, particularly on house building. And a lot of conversations about placemaking and how that relates to home building, which I think is great. I think there's no question that we're in need of that. I do think it feels like there's a lack of reference to design specifically and being specific about what good design might be. And so that's still sort of an open question about how maybe the new government feels about design and how important that is, or whether it is just delivering on metrics of quantity of new homes. And so what we would love to see, and we're actually writing at the moment, it's still in its infancy. You joined actually one of the early discussions about it. So we've got a group of stakeholders together to try and imagine how the principles of Humanise might inform a policy paper that could maybe help define a little bit more specifically what design could be, or what good design could look like, so that as they are rolling out this placemaking home building program over the next 5, 10, 15 years, that you can sort of look to something and there's a little bit more specificity, because at the moment it just feels a bit absent. So it's still in its early stage, it's not pinned down, but we would love to publish that and hope that it might be something that the government read and it
sort of like bring
something.
Design back into the forefront, like you say, so not just about numbers, but also, because I guess the last government tried with their Building Beautiful campaign, which again got a lot of criticism. How would you say that would compare?
I don't know, but I think we don't hate the word beauty.
No,
we're not
beauty's not a
scared
bad
of the
word.
word beauty.
Yeah.
Not a bad word, but I
And
can
the opposite
understand
is boring, which is used a lot in the book.
The opposite is boring, but I can absolutely see like a change in government. You know, you've got to show like they couldn't keep that going.
Yeah, yeah.
But certainly like the ambition in quantity feels there, and I think there's a lot of like talking about the right things.
Yeah, there has been words about placemaking and good design, but I guess what that is.
Because you can say good design.
Yeah.
It's what does it? How do you start to define some boundaries around that? And I think there's actually been a lot of good work on placemaking, and why we're particularly focused on the outside of buildings is there have been good public discussions about access to green space, about you know, active routes of transport, whether it's more cycle routes or you know, wider pavements, pedestrianisation, places to dwell, pocket parks. There have been good conversations. I think generally cities are waking up to that more and more, and things are getting better. But it just doesn't feel like there's been a conversation about, well, hold on a minute, you can make the great park or that little public square, but the facades of that room,
what's the backdrop?
Like, what
what's
are
the
they?
theatre?
Are they nourishing for you? Do they make you feel uplifted? And that felt like there just isn't a conversation about it at the moment.
And do we think that's where, because obviously we have a lot of NIMBYism in the UK for many different reasons, but do you think that's where some of that comes from, that actually a lot of new builds have not been that engaging or exciting or beautiful to look at, that I think a lot of people lack trust in new builds? Like if actually they are better designed, people might be more accepting of them.
I would like to think that. I don't know. Like NIMBYism is a really curious thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think that whatever the solution might be, you're never going. NIMBYism will always be there.
Yeah.
It's like even if I love that design, but if it was a kilometre down the road, I would love it. I would really love it. So I don't know. But I do also think that you know a lot of people have sort of pointed the finger at contemporary design and NIMBYism being associated with heritage, and I mean, I wouldn't tie that completely together. Like, I think, so we, as within the book, there's actually a spread of the general public's 10 favourite buildings, either in the UK or the world, I can't remember. And I think 5 or 6 of them are actually contemporary buildings. So it isn't necessarily
the Shard
about
is one, isn't it?
the Shard is one, the Eden Project is one. So it's not actually about, like, it's just everyone wants us to rebuild Victorian terraces. For us, it's about that, you know, up to 100 years ago, a building wasn't built without visual complexity.
Yeah.
It didn't exist. It wasn't a thing. A fisherman's hut.
Even the sewage works.
The sewage works, a pump house, up to a cathedral. For it to be worth building, it was worth investing that time and attention and craft and detail into it. And somewhere along the way over the last 100 years, that's been lost. And I think that's more what people are reacting to. And the easiest way to point to it is to say, can you make it more like it was? And yeah, don't know if that answered the question.
No,
I've even forgotten what the question was, but
I forgot. I think it was about NIMBYism.
Yeah, okay.
But I guess, it's good to say, I think maybe we wrap up on the point that you are optimistic for the future.
Totally. I think I feel a little bit like working on architectural projects, parts of cities. Fundamental optimism is like a prerequisite to make the projects happen. And I think it's something that I think the whole studio has. But I do feel optimistic about the future, and I look forward to seeing what this, the next government delivers on.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we can end there. That was
great.